Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have 39 participants now, and it's just a pleasure to be able to start with our presentations with Dr. John Mark Reynolds speaking to us about Orthodox classical education. And I have heard him speak on this topic several times, and it's always eye-opening and challenging and encouraging. So I know we're in for a treat this evening. For those of you that are not familiar with Dr. John Mark, he is the president of the St. Constantine School in Houston, Texas, the former provost of Houston Baptist University, and the founder and director of the Torrey Honors Institute at Biola University. Received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Rochester, the author of several books, including When Athens Met Jerusalem, An Introduction to Classical and Christian Thought. He is a frequent blogger, lecturer, and attends St. Paul Orthodox Church in Katy, Texas, with his parents, his brother, his wife, and his children. And we're just really delighted to have him with us this evening. A couple of housekeeping items before I ask Sayedna if he would open in prayer and give us his blessing as we begin. I am going to ask that if we would all, except for Dr. John Mark, if we would all keep our microphones muted during the presentation. That will help all of us to have a better listening experience. And then towards the end of the presentation, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A with Dr. John Mark. And since we have 39, 40 people in here, I think what we'll do is we'll ask you to put your questions in the chat box. And then at the end of that time, I'll go through the chat box and we'll do our best to pose your question to Dr. John Mark as much as we're able to in the time that we have. And so when we get to the end of that discussion or the end of the presentation, then you can go ahead and type those questions in, and then I'll go through them and read them off one at a time.
If they're too cruel, you will help me, right? You'll get rid of the truly cruel questions. And I'll try to move along because such a distinguished group, probably more fun to do the Q&A than hear anything I have to say. So
well, we'll look forward to both. So the one other item is we are recording this presentation, and I've had a number of people email me already asking about having this available because they couldn't attend tonight. They were busy. We will be posting the recordings to all of these presentations on the St. Emilia Ministries website. And that is St. Emilia, 2 M's, stemilia.com. We'll send out information. I'm sure Sayedna will share that broadly as well once we get those on there. And also just want to say a big thank you to the St. Constantine School for allowing us to use their Zoom technology to be able to have these presentations this week. So Sayedna, would you please open us in prayer and give us your blessing, and then we'll pitch it to Dr. John Mark.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory of the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit, one God, amen. O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Mighty God, who knows that we can do nothing without thine assistance and guidance, direct us, we pray, to divine wisdom and power, that we may accomplish what we set out to do this evening, faithfully, diligently, and according to your will, so that it may be profitable ourselves and all that we serve. We ask this in the name of the Father, and of the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen.
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 Well, welcome,
Well,
Dr.
it's an
John
honor.
Mark.
Yes, it's an honor to be here tonight, and hopefully we'll talk about things that matter. But let me begin with a thesis that's twofold. The first is the negative side, and I'm not going to spend very much time on it because if you don't think it's true, go pick up the Chronicle of Higher Education. Higher education and K through 12 education, but particularly college education, is in a crisis. There was a demographic problem coming around the year 2025. Many liberal arts colleges already have budgets that were difficult. The administrative state has exploded. Colleges have often gotten out of contact with parents and with the values of the community that they're in. If you were to attend the University of Alabama, it would have more in common with the University of California, Berkeley, in terms of worldview and ideology than with the surrounding communities in either case. In other words, a state university at any school has more in common with another state university than it does with the people nearby. Now, these tensions in education have always kind of existed, but they've gotten worse and worse, and with massive debt loads being placed on students. A graduate of the St. Constantine College, we had our first college graduate, Bishop Thomas, last weekend. So a week, Saturday was the first graduation. And one of the graduates by sophomore year had acquired about $100,000 in college debt. And that was the debt limit, and they were asked to leave. And so if you can imagine somebody who's invested in their life, first generation college student, unsure what to do, signing massive amounts of paper, you can see that there was a rising tension. Well, if you combine that with the coronavirus, then you have a real moment of crisis, as many tuition-driven schools, not so much state schools, no longer have this kind of guaranteed tuition income. Maybe a quarter of your student body isn't going to come. If you're running a New York City school, are people going to fly into New York and go to school? So this has created a financial crisis. But I'd like to suggest, from the point of view of Orthodox Christians, there has long been an ideological crisis. So many of the problems of this present age, revolutionary ideologies, atheistic ideologies, have come out of education. People often wonder, what happened to our country, or what happened to values in certain areas? And when people spend 5 days a week getting one perspective, we're at a lot of places, as a good friend of mine in philosophy put it, Christianity doesn't even rise to the level inside the classroom of being wrong. It's not so much that we're refuted. It's not so much that people challenge the truth. It is that our ideas don't even rise to the level of being wrong. We can sometimes be so ignored that we might think we're escaping. But instead, the foundations are made shaky. Because if you learn that truth says this, and then the church is a nice place, a pious place, but that doesn't have anything to do with science. It doesn't have anything to do with reality, the way we look at the world. If we're not very careful, then the deepest, truest truth, the thing that should shape our lives, becomes a kind of add-on, a social club, and of course, can disappear very quickly. We can go from people centering their lives around the church to people not paying any attention to the church whatsoever. The good news is this. Models of Christian education have, unfortunately, in my opinion, built themselves on some of the defects of the Western European Christian experience. They haven't had the gift of orthodoxy. And so while we're grateful for Christian schools, for the parochial school system, lots of Orthodox people send their children to Catholic schools in so many areas. And even though sometimes superficially an Orthodox school, a classical Christian Orthodox school, would look a lot like the local parochial K through 12, I think there are some fundamental differences that if we can revive those differences, if we can produce a genuinely Orthodox Christian education that reaches out to everyone in our community, we can become the solution to the cries for justice that we see around us in the community. We can become the solution to the crisis in education. We can somehow, and I'll try to show you how, produce an education that does not alienate people from science, that does not alienate them from the best of philosophy, but integrates it in a foundational view of the world that's deeply Orthodox. We have the ability to do something that Western churches can't, and I think it's because of a deep philosophy of education. So I'm going to start sharing a screen with you. Can everybody see? You should see an image of some delightful children. And this is Christmas. Bishop Thomas, do you recognize the church here? We outgrew every place else.
I was ordained to the priesthood in that church.
Yes, if you looked very closely, you'll see someone, it's not the entire school. This fall, the school will be about 315 students, but this is a choir. Bishop Basil, of course, did a setting. They performed that inside. And this is the last thing they did. You'd see a student there ranging in age from about 4 years old up into the mid-20s with some of our college students doing a Christmas concert. We had about 15 students graduate. They'll attend colleges all over Texas and the United States. We have students at Rice, Texas A&M. But what we were really excited about in the last week or so was our ability to produce our first class of college graduates. Here are some of the faculty at the college program at St. Constantine with one of our graduates. One of our graduates is headed off to law school. Others are moving into education in the business world. But here's a shot of college graduation. This is the closest thing I'm going to do for an advertisement. Pray for us. The ad is pray for us. You send us money, just pray for us and pray that God will bless and multiply what we're doing as we're looking for record classes in both groups. Notice something. What did I just show you? We have the community. These are parents of our youngest student, actually in the nursery is 0. We have a faculty nursery correctly. And here we have a college student. He delayed college graduation for a little while. I think 26, 27 years old, helped us teach while he was at school. Now we're sending him off into the world. Notice how integrated into the entire community this is. Instead of taking, for example, our college students or even our high school students out of the church and providing a church for them in the college, we send them into our local parishes. We integrate ourselves into the life of the community so that many of our college students are working with the nursery students, or many of our high school students end up working in the garden with 7th and 8th graders, a much more whole and integrated vision of how education should work. Well, this is a talk where, in some ways, if you think about the beginning of the talk, you understand it altogether. My general thesis is this. Think of Jesus walking along with his disciples on the road to Emmaus. Cleopas and that unnamed person had true felt needs. They needed something, and they needed to know that Jesus had been risen from the dead. Jesus could have immediately met their felt needs. And instead, Jesus appeared to them and hid himself. Well, I'm talking to a bunch of people with sophisticated theology and thoughts, and I'm not a theologian, I'm a philosopher. I don't even play a theologian on television, despite the way I'm appearing to you just now. But here's a simple thing I thought once. My dad pastored for many years as a priest inside the Episcopal Church before coming to Orthodoxy, now serves as Bishop Thomas helped bring him into the faith, and serves now as a subdeacon in our area in his 80s, still faithfully pursuing the truth. But I was listening to my dad preach once, and I was sitting there thinking, and I realized that Jesus decided not to meet their felt needs. This is a very superficial observation. He decided to meet their real needs. And then he asked them a series of questions to which these two give wrong answers. And he begins to talk to them and explain to them the teachings of the sacred scriptures about, and I'm paraphrasing here, how the Son of Man has to suffer and die, and the truth of scripture. Well, when I was a little boy, I remember being really frustrated because the part of the story that I wanted to hear was the teaching, which didn't appear there. What I got was the story, and then Jesus revealing himself to them, as he does to us when we see the true light in the mysteries of the church, in the breaking of the bread. And I thought, what in the world? But the longer I thought about it, and I was a weird kid, you should have had me in Sunday school. It was really fate worse than death for my poor Sunday school teachers. I realized something. God wanted us, all of us, to walk with him on the road to Emmaus. God wasn't interested in meeting these men's felt needs, at least educationally. He was interested in hearing their thoughts, expounding with them, causing them to wonder about what he was saying, wonder about who this was who was teaching them, and only then reveal himself. Because, of course, in one way, we don't do education at the moment of receiving the precious body and blood of Christ. If you see Jesus, if Jesus were to Zoom bomb us, and would that would happen, and appear to us and give us a message, every bit of education, I hope, would stop. I hope I would cease to say anything. We would not be wondering about anything. We would fall down and worship the Lord Jesus, and we would take what he said and we would worship. That would be the response. And that's better than anything we could do inside of education. But learning and education, this process, is something that Jesus wants us to do. Wants us to bring together with him. So in some ways, my suggestion is there is both in what we call Socratic teaching, but should be called Christological teaching. It's the teaching perfected by the greatest teacher, Jesus. There is eat my flesh, drink my blood. Well, what do you mean, Lord? Here's what I mean. Eat my flesh, drink my blood. There's an invitation there to wondering. And it will be my thesis that this tension between seeing eventually in the liturgy and this moment of wondering, that is Orthodox Christian education. And that's what's wrong with so much secular education. It isn't that it can't produce wonder. The heavens proclaim the glory of the Lord. So if we go out and see the glory of the heavens, we're led to wonder. When I dialogue with atheists or debate atheists, they'll often say, look, Reynolds, we don't need Christianity. We can wonder just by looking at the glories of nature. Right. The Creator has placed goodness, truth, and beauty inside even our broken world. Fundamentally, he said it was good. And so there is this moment of wonder where anyone can learn from creation. But of course, I think in the end, this is sterile. It doesn't lead anywhere. And so I don't want to put a big burden on the bishops, but I want to say this is the moment for Orthodox Christian education. This is the moment where we can bring to the fore the fullness, and in some ways, a very odd thing. We've done a good job at building churches, but the fullness of Orthodoxy is found, if you'll pardon me, in a kind of village, in a community, where there are hospitals, where there are schools, where there is a community of families living together. And yes, life is centered in the liturgical calendar, and we go to church more often than we do, and certainly more often than we've been able to do in a pandemic. But church is one aspect of a full Orthodox life. I think that's why so many communities that still retain this kind of structure, where the village exists, or the city, the enclave of Orthodox people still exist in a city, with the fullness of what Western people might call secular culture, but I would call Orthodox culture, the ministry of being an Orthodox layperson. A little bit, and I don't want to get into the politics of Byzantium, which is complex and fraught with peril for a philosopher, but a little bit the role the emperors and the state would serve inside a full-blown Orthodox commonwealth. There was a real work and ministry to be done there. And it's wonder that I think is the tension. Here's a beautiful thing. I know this is late in time, but if you'll let me use this image that the St. Constantine School uses all the time, the eagle inside of Orthodox education has two heads. This conversation then between the classical, between the pagan, if we were to cite Bishop St. Basil, and the Christian in Orthodox education is long-standing. Our curriculum doesn't come to us from Augustine even, or from the West. Oxford and Cambridge borrowed their educational patterns from the East, from the Byzantine Commonwealth, between the long-standing, never-ending conversation that took place in cities like Constantinople or Antioch or Alexandria, between what we might think of as living in the world and waiting for the world to come. This two-headedness in one body is a beautiful image for how the dialectic works, how the conversation is to work inside of schools. You'll notice, to not pull my punches for later, that the Roman eagle in the West too often was one-headed. And so you can think of Western history, especially in education, as being a long conversation about whether the secular state should control education or whether the church should control education. Now, here's a truth. The answer to that question is no. It's a bad question. It's a little bit like church-state relations. When the eagle has one head, this is just very fraught with peril. The tension that needs to exist this side of paradise before the coming of King Jesus, before the glorification that brings everything together, no longer exists if everything is done by the Pope. This is why the parochial school model, in my opinion, Your Grace, Bishop Thomas, is not something we just want to pick up and imitate. And if we look to ancient lands, isn't something that particularly existed normatively. It would be something that we could pick up. We neither want the church to control education directly, nor do we want a secular state to control education. In some ways, we want Orthodox lay people who are themselves in full communion in obedience to a bishop, producing schools out of the fullness of their faith. And this is something that doesn't exist on the Western model of education, where either a neutral so-called state is running a school, it's about where 90% of students go, or a church itself is running the school. By the way, what happens too often in a school that's utterly controlled by the church, that's exhaustively, where this tension doesn't exist, the natural inclination of young adults is to grow up and rebel against something. But when all the authority, when there's no tension between the authority, and I mean this in a healthy way of tension, because they're in agreement about morals, but you have parents and you have teachers and you have priests, pastors, and you have other members of the community, and they're all speaking into the life of a student, they create not one thing against which to rebel. Whereas if too many of the things, sort of extreme views of isolated homeschooling that exist, I homeschooled all 4 of my kids, so this isn't a criticism of homeschooling per se, and I know so many of you do. It is to say, so many Protestants have gone wrong because they'll do home church, if you can imagine that. You know, the dad will be the pastor of the church, and they'll do a home business, and they'll do homeschool, and all of these things create not enough tension, not enough protection, not enough dialogue. I guess if we lived in heaven and the Father was Jesus, we would be perfect. But since we are imperfect, this tends to multiply our imperfections and not produce the wonderful checks and balances, dialogue, that I think produce science, that produced many of the good things, many of the cultural things we take for granted. So I'm very excited about this. Here's the bottom line. Orthodoxy is true, and we have the answer. We have the solution. I don't, but we as a whole, as a community, have the solution to the problems that beset our time. So I just want to make some small historical points. Secular education, and by this I mean education that wasn't just run by the church. Notice with the so-called fall of the Roman Empire in the West, who kept the church, who kept schools going to the extent that they were kept going? The church. Well, thank God for that. That beats there being no education or no cultural engagement or no production of music and the arts. On the other hand, the Orthodox, in the great Orthodox Commonwealth, kept a really elementary through university education with a nearly continuous history throughout time. So many of my students, when I was teaching college in California, who came from non-Orthodox traditions, many of whom ended up becoming Orthodox over the course of time, had been taught what amounts to a Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire picture of Constantinople. Christianity seized control of the eastern parts of the Roman Empire, and it just became decadent and fell apart. and nothing good ever came of it, and it collapsed. Well, if you think about that even for a minute, you know that has to be false, because 1,000 years of collapsing is a long time to collapse. The other thing that my students often believe, because they've been taught this in public schools in the United States, is that Constantinople produced no great art, no great literature, no great culture outside of religious, priceless religious beauty. And that's a good thing. It's good that they knew about that. And I'm not putting that down. But what they didn't hear is that people were reading for most of the Eastern Roman Empire and commenting on Plato for hundreds and hundreds of years. There was a continuous tradition. Where, in fact, did the Renaissance come from? Well, those parts of Italy that had had lots of contact with the Greek-reading, Greek-speaking people of Constantinople, and had often been controlled by those areas. So this whole image in the West, that there was a giant dark age, and then suddenly there was a rebirth of knowledge, and this all occurred around 1453 because Constantinople fell and texts were released to us, is just false. Because there was this continuous educational system. Now, we don't look back to the past as a golden age. I am not saying things were perfect. I am saying that on Christian reflection, some things were done properly in the East, because the East didn't go through the same kind of cataclysmic collapse that occurred in the West. Instead, we were able to maintain, by God's good grace, teaching and education. So theological education, and boy, I'm talking to theologians about it, was less a product of theological schools. Think about how schools are on this image, and more in a monastic type community. But by 425, Theodosius had founded what amounts to a university. Of course, that's an anachronistic term, inside of Constantinople, far predating anything that occurred in the West. And so sometimes I'm asked by my Western Christian friends, why are you Orthodox copying us? We have one-on-one tutorials at the College of St. Constantine for the college students, not unlike Oxford. And my question to them is, you don't even show enough gratitude for the Bible. We let you use that for centuries now. But yes, you're welcome. We let you borrow classical Christian education too. Please remember that. Just really briefly, it's worth noting something I'm sure all of you already know, which is education didn't die when the empire fell in the West. In fact, in the East, it continued for most of the Byzantine Commonwealth period, or the Eastern Roman period. There was nearly universal education at the elementary level for men. And there was some access for women. Now, it's sad that there wasn't more access for women, but there was always some. Elementary education consisted of reading and writing training. Secondary education would move into classical literature and included learning classical Greek, and even Latin right up through the 6th century was often taught. And then you move into the third stage of classical education, that is rhetoric and imitation. And then finally, philosophy, you might be exposed to the writings of Plato more than Aristotle, but sometimes Aristotle. And then finally, there was a kind of higher education, though in many ways it's a little more like what we would think of as a trade school for law, for philosophy, and for medicine, things like that, through apprenticeships for these things. So this is very exciting. I think when you see this, you see, look, we have a heritage, and it's not quite the Western heritage, because in some ways the West dealt with a culture in 200 or 300 years of turmoil that had to be saved, that had to be revived, but began to get cut off from the great fount of classical learning. And thanks be to God, the church was able to help preserve this. Because this is the other point. His Grace Bishop Thomas, I think you're the leader of the educational ministry of the church. Is that right? That's your appointment? Do you have that roughly right?
What did you say? Repeat that, please.
Are you the leader of our educational wing in the Antiochian? Have you been a?
Well, I'm the hierarchical overseer for the Department of Christian Education, and also the hierarchical overseer for the Department of Homeschooling.
That's awesome. I guess this slide puts a great burden on you. It says that when we're in down periods, and I'd suggest that though we are materially wealthy in the United States, we have been hollowed out. Yeah.
Doctor, I don't want people to become overly impressed. You'll see Deacon David Hyatt is there. Father Noah is not on, but they're the ones that do all the work. All the thing I do is show my face to be a hierarch. I'm not the person that does the work for these departments. They're very capable people, but because I had some background in education, Sayyid Joseph was very kind to appoint me to that position. But don't get too impressed with it.
Okay, well, good. Then it means you can share this burden, because here's my thesis. What was good and what was inherited from the East, and even was in some ways able to be inherited and continue, because so much of our churches fell into captivity, became second-class citizens, found it harder to fully express a culture. Even the Russians, of course, for long periods of time, were in a kind of captivity to foreign powers. The church would then step in and fulfill keeping the seeds, the cradle of education, alive for a time period when lay people, and God help me, I would like to be one of these people, we step in and begin to do the work. We begin to create the village. I mean, the same thing is true of hospital, medical care, hospitality, what we might call hostels. And so the active religious life of the Eastern Roman community often gave a rich catechesis to the average subject of the emperor. Where do we learn real theology, in other words? In compatibility with the school, St. Constantine, for example, has chapel every day, imitated from the Cathedral Church in Wichita. And we have divine liturgy 2 or 3 times at our site. But mostly the catechesis, the deep catechesis, has to come through the church. And so the school and the church, while have different ministries, in some ways, again, think of the two-headed eagle, they have one body, but they're doing 2 different things. And when this can occur, when the catechesis can occur with a wonderful priest in the life of a rich parish, with people who are older and people who are younger, with children, all worshiping together in the cathedral, in the beauty of what's going on there. And then in school, inside the Orthodox community, scientists are teaching them how to use a microscope, how to examine God's world, teaching them the great languages of Orthodoxy. And St. Constantine, I think we do French, Spanish, Latin, Greek, and Arabic currently. We're too small to add any other languages right now. But this occurs in a school context where, with priests involved, of course, coming and leading our prayers, lay people are acting as mentors and guides. And this is the normative life of the church. This is creating a village structure in which our pastors and many of you can work. Now, let's remember something. Until King Jesus returns, until the city comes lowering down 4 square, there will always be a tension inside of education that doesn't exist in the liturgy of the church. The liturgy of the church, a kind of foretaste of paradise, is perfect. There we see God. We see God face to face. The fullness of God is manifested to us. We see the true light come into the world. Unfortunately, so much of other truths are found in fragmented, broken ways. They come from people who lived before the coming of the Christ, when we could see God's glory full of grace and truth. And so someone like Plato in his Republic desperately wanted to know what justice was. He wanted to live in a city. Isn't that true of America right now? We long to know what justice is. We long to see God's justice in the world. Well, what is justice? So Plato starts his great dialogue, the Republic, which really should be titled On Justice. It's a later Latin edition, Republic. And he says this: we don't just want justice that seems just, that's for prizes, or, so that I can become leader of the city, or so that people can think well of us. We would like someone who is just for justice's own sake. Plato says. But if such a man came to be, Republic Book 2, we would take that man and we would beat him and then we would crucify him. And of course, when Christians saw this and when non-Christians heard, for example, in Acts chapter 17, the truth of the gospel, this was so pointed that some modern translations will not translate the word for crucifixion, because at least when I was in grad school, I turned to my secular agnostic Greek teacher and said, "What does this mean?" And he leaned over and said, "It means what you think it means." And he meant it. He knew that I had a Christian background. And then Plato struggles along. If we kill the just man, if the just man is someone we can't handle because we'd rather have people that seem to be just than real just people, what are we going to do? And he works and works and works on it. And finally, by the end of the Republic, which you'll be glad I'm not going to work through with you, lest you go crazy, something beautiful happens. He says this: what we really need is for some man to die and go and see that God is just and come back from the dead and tell us. The problem is this has never happened. So I will tell you a story as if it happened. And if we can believe that story, then it will save us. But it's hard to believe a story that you just made up. Do you see the opportunity there? Is classical thought, then Plato said a bunch of other things in the Republic that are deeply false and broken, and that have to submit to the truth of the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. But there are such glimmers of truth. There's such great value. Plato's love of mathematics, for example, that he picked up from the Pythagoreans, helped in Christian hands to produce the scientific revolution. How could something as abstract as a number, the number 1, which we cannot see, taste, or feel, describe our world so accurately? Why does music, that most passionate of the arts seemingly, have an ability to be made mathematical? All of these things Plato saw, but none of them produced science until the coming of Orthodox Christianity, which set free people's assumptions, bad assumptions. So classical thought is varied, and that's true of modern secular ideas. If we want to learn economics, we talk to an economist. If we need help against the virus, we look to medical doctors and medical science. The church has never had problems with this. And yet, though the facts don't change if you're a Christian, the is of the world, science can never tell us what we ought to do. So often, even in this situation with the virus, people who have worshiped science, who have given the eagle one head, will say, well, we're just going to follow science. But science can only describe for us what is the case. It requires an ethical, philosophical, and theological system to begin to unpack the is and tell us what we ought to do. The famous is-ought distinction. The church, in other words, contains the truth needed for salvation, how to live in the world. So a Christian school can never be perfect the way the liturgy is perfect. It can never be a full vision of reality. It's always in dialogue with the church, and it's always being corrected by the truths of the church. In some ways, that queen of the sciences, theology, will always be causing us to submit, but not theology in the Western sense that is merely a matter of the intellect, but theology at the deepest level where head, heart, and hand come together in a full incarnation to see the world. My suggestion is that the problems of education have always existed in the West, and they have always existed, and they've existed when the Orthodox too often imitate merely Western forms, because the temptation is to solve any tension. You know, everyone's thinking of their particular hard philosophical problems or ethical questions or things that we aren't sure about. We'd like to know for sure what the truth is. For example, there are always tensions between what we might call best science, the best theories of science, and what the church seems to say about the world. And hasty people always try, if the eagle has to have one head, to quickly resolve those. One of my friends in philosophy put it this way. There are some people that act this way. If science seems to be indicating this for right now, then theology can go to smash. And then there's a certain religious fundamentalist who can't keep in tension truths that don't seem to fit together. They take theology, or at least their understanding of theology, and they tell falsehoods. They will even tell lies in the name of Jesus about what science seems to say, because they have to resolve it very quickly. They can't live inside the mystery, inside the tension that always will have to exist this side of paradise. They need the eagle to have one head. So if we do this, I think we reduce tensions in education at the cost of life. Life is found in this creative tension. The reduction, notice, can be done in secular, atheistic, or fundamentalist religious directions. Religion, our little group of religious leaders are going to tell us what to do or think. They're going to tell us how the world goes. They're going to check and decide everything. Or we don't have to listen to religious people at all. We're just going to do what science says, and we import the oughts, what we ought to do, without even noticing. Here's a very simple example. Let's assume for a minute, I'm not a medical doctor, and so this is a purely hypothetical, that the medical community agrees about how to stop the spread of the virus absolutely. If we all separated ourselves and lived as hermits, the virus, and we did that for 40 days, would stop. This is a pure hypothetical. Please don't try this at home. I'm not a medical doctor. Now the question is that what we should do? Because there are other goods, there are other things worth doing than stopping the spread of the virus. What would we be willing to do to stop the spread of the virus? And what would we be willing not to do? There are lots of different values. And notice science itself can tell you perhaps how best to go about achieving what you want once you decide what you want, but it can't tell you what you want. And it can't tell you what you should want. And so there will always be a tension as the church, our mother, the church, and ethicists and philosophers and medical doctors come together. Bishop Thomas helped sponsor several medical ethics conferences. I know right when I came to Houston, when I first came to Houston and was involved in those. Are there answers? Yes. Are there things generally the church knows are wrong? Yes. And then working them out in the real world becomes complex. So we always will live in a degree of tension. It makes me very happy, this reading from St. Basil. He talks to young men about how to be educated. And if you haven't read this article, you should, because it's a kind of mandate for how we do education at the St. Constantine School. It's probably the single most important article, in my opinion, or sermon ever given on the nature of education. And we should all just stop and go read that sermon and not listen to anything else I say, because it would be better. But you're not so lucky. I'll read you a piece of it that I think cuts to the heart of what I'm saying. To be sure, says the saint, we shall become more intimately acquainted with these precepts. These are the truths of God, the truths of the world in the sacred writings. But it is incumbent upon us, for the present, to trace, as it were, this is so beautiful, the silhouette of virtue in the pagan authors. I hope, Your Grace, that I win the I Really Hate Communism prize. I really dislike modern forms of communism. But what I did when I began to think about communism, Marxism, in its many different forms, to understand it, was first try to see what people created in the image of God had seen in it. I looked for silhouettes, and they were very, very vague to me. I could hardly see any. But even there, I could see silhouettes of virtue, a concern about justice, a concern about people having food that was sufficient for them. I found first the silhouettes of virtue, and then, having learned to love what was even dimly good and true, I could then understand it better, to take what was good and move forward. After all, St. Basil here is talking about Homer more than any other author, who is a thoroughgoing pagan and has very bad views about how to treat slaves and how to treat other people. You're going to hear my dog. We have a brand new puppy named Nessie, and she's about to attack me for some reason or another. Who knows why? She's very wonderful. Actually, she's more likely to lick me to death than do anything else. If you're lucky, you'll get to see her. You can see her very far in the back. If we can learn from Homer, and St. Basil was telling us we can learn from Homer, then we can learn from even so-called secular science. We don't learn uncritically. We can learn from modern secular philosophers. We can do all of this because what are we doing? Just as the great saint is saying we can do in that master polytheistic pagan warmonger Homer, we can find the silhouettes of virtue. When I see Odysseus struggling to go home, to find that home, who is so lost, and yet is brought home by the constancy of the virtue and love of his wife, even when he fails that love, then I can learn, as St. Basil says in his sermon, some great virtue from even Homer. For those who carefully gather, the useful from each book are wont like mighty rivers to gain accessions on every hand. Notice, to the fundamentalist religious person, we should burn Homer. To, I fear, some people who worship philosophy, secular philosophy, Christianity is only good insofar as it can kind of introduce smart people to philosophy, and philosophy becomes more important than Christianity. I fear that this happened in origin. What did Athens have to do with Jerusalem? One person who became a heretic said nothing and ended his life in a strange sect doing odd religious rituals. Another person said, well, really, Athens is dominant and Jerusalem is kind of what people who can't understand philosophy do. St. Basil refused to do either thing. St. Basil said, we can find the truth, the silhouette of virtue, even in the pagan authors. And I just want to say this, out of this tension comes the cathedrals and the magnificent art of even the Western Renaissance. Comes science, comes mathematics, comes fecundity, comes life itself, because we can educate. This is not skepticism. Notice wonder gone bad. Wonder in the hands of an atheist becomes skepticism, which is brutal and grinding. I don't know. I now have 4 adult children, thanks be to God, homeschooled all of them. But they all had an age where they would just ask questions. Why? Why is the sky blue? And you would give them some kind of answer. This is pre-Wikipedia, so you couldn't look it up easily when some of them were small. And then, can anyone guess the next question? It was, why? Why that? And it didn't take them very long on most issues. My kids never asked me questions about Plato for really obvious reasons, for them to exhaust my knowledge. And I was always tempted to say, because I said so. I think I avoided that most of the time. But this sort of endless why is cute in a child, but toxic in an adult. Because there's no such thing as a bad question sincerely asked, but endless questioning, endless skepticism that sees through everything can't produce science. It can't produce great art. All it can do is make fun of things. I'm not going to try to be a pastor, but some of you who pastor or teach or work in Christian education, surely you've noticed that more and more and more, the eye roll has replaced humor. Sarcasm or making fun of something or taking it down a notch has become our primary sense of humor, because as even the glimmers of orthodoxy in the culture around us begin to fade, as the Christian heritage fades from a culture, as the tension between heaven and earth, between the two heads, between the glimmers of glory in the pagans, and between the truth in the mysteries of the Sunday morning service begin to fade for us, then all that is left is a kind of toxic skepticism. It's what Philip Johnson, a mentor at UC Berkeley, called the grand says who. Says who? That can be the only response. And some educations now, at our universities in particular, but even in high school, become teaching kids to say says who in a semi-intellectual way. But notice, this isn't the production of anything good, true, and beautiful. It isn't the production of anything we need. It's simply appropriating it for self and then mocking it. Humor dies. Joy dies. Comedy dies. One way of looking at life from a Christian point of view is comedies end in weddings and tragedies end in death in theater, traditionally. The Christian story is a divine comedy that ends in a wedding but is punctuated with tragedy. Too often, this loss of wonder that turns into skepticism gives us a picture of life as a grand tragedy with a few moments of comedy. And the comedy becomes more and more mockery, more and more ugly. Wonder is the opposite of this. Wonder is the sincere question that says, wow, there are the heavens. They proclaim the glory of God. Here's the Pythagorean theorem. How do I bring these two things together? About February, right before they closed everything down for the pandemic, I was able to travel to the Arvo Part Center in Estonia and talk in some ways like this about the nature of Orthodox education. And this great Orthodox composer was there, and he's still creating great beauty in the world. And we got to listen to a concert, far better than anything I said, of his music there in Estonia. And what you could see was, this is a man of great gifts taking musical tools and full of wonder, then also taking pieces of the liturgy and pieces of secular learning and fusing them together in something deeply beautiful. This wonder is the intellectual virtue that I think best describes the tension that we live in before the return of Christ. Wisdom, then, is driven by the fear of the Lord, where we know ourselves, our place, by seeing God. To see God is to be filled with love. We see beauty, and the proper response to beauty is love. One reason I hesitated about becoming Orthodox is because the church was so beautiful that I was afraid it was wrong to love her, which is a big mistake that we make. The proper response of beauty is love. And then love drives us to see more of God and to look for God in every place always, whether that's in science or mathematics or music or in art. We become creative. Wonder is the virtue that skepticism destroys. This is the sense where we become, as teachers, like little children. God help us if we ever set up a school that crushes the wonder from children, either by imposing on them the dry answers of bloodless atheism, or a kind of false fundamentalism that too hastily comes to answers or repeats answers in a bloodless and lifeless way. I've suggested to you, and then we'll take most of the rest of our time together with questions. I've suggested to you that wondering produces all the arts and sciences, and because that's such a weird thing to say, I'd like to try to argue for it. Yes, the father of education, the father of our logos before us. Wondering produces all the arts and sciences. How could that be true? Aristotle was very frustrated with the Greek students of his time. And he was frustrated because he found worms and things like worms fascinating. Like a child, he was full of wonder. But he couldn't get gentlemen, people who were rich and smart, the kind of person who could come to school, to look at worms because they were gross. They were material. In most views of reality, one of two things happen. The eagle, yes, I'm a cuckoo. You hear it. My students love it. One of my students knocked down, I have a cuckoo clock here because I teach in my house a lot. And I have a cuckoo clock in my office classroom. And a student knocked down the cuckoo clock in the classroom, and I couldn't afford to fix it. But so many students complained that they could no longer laugh at me that I had to fix the cuckoo clock and bring it back. And when I moved into my St. Constantine office, a group of students on Facebook saw the picture of my office and said, the first thing they said was, "Where is the cuckoo clock?" So I may have said nothing memorable, but I probably sold more than one cuckoo clock over the course of my educational career. Anyway, we look at the world. So we look at reality and we wonder, and so how do we get science? Well, Aristotle had these Greek men who didn't want to look at worms because they only wanted to think about ideas. So as I was saying, we make one of two mistakes. We either divinize nature, in which case we can't study it, we can only worship it. Or we get so into mathematical objects and ideas and philosophy that we no longer want to do anything with our hands. We no longer want to live in the real world. We no longer want to study things. We just go off and think. Now, notice both working with our hands, good, thinking, good, thinking about abstract objects like mathematical objects, couldn't have science, couldn't have medicine without this. But religion, atheistic religion or polytheism, that reduces the world to God kills science because you can't dissect God. On the other hand, if you drive God out of reality, too often you'll start living in your head. You'll become an ideologue. People always ask me, how could revolutionaries do all the terrible things they do? Ideologues can always do terrible things because the horrible thing that's happening to you, I guess I'm looking at Allison Deeb. The horrible thing that happens to you, Allison, I've probably mispronounced your name and I'm sorry. I have West Virginia pronunciations through upstate New York life. When I was a little boy, they moved me from West. Yeah, go ahead, Your Grace.
Yeah, don't talk about West Virginia, please. I'm in West Virginia, okay? We don't want to make the people here mad, okay?
No, that's almost heaven. My family lived in West Virginia for about 300 years. So right down the street.
You might be almost heaven, but the people in Houston, Texas think they're a lot closer. I can tell you that.
Well, I can tell you what happened in the pandemic. We were sitting here in Houston, and there was God. God came to downtown Houston, and we asked, Lord, why are you here? And he said, because everyone has had to go home, and so it's Texas. No, it's a horrible Texas joke. Forget it. It's just very terrible. And yeah, Texans. That's what they think. In any case. Notice that for Christians, and Christians alone in some ways, the incarnation of Jesus solves all this problem of education that Aristotle faced. The Word became flesh, and we beheld his glory, glorious of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. When the Word became flesh, science, art, music, where in some ways our art and music were glorified because matter mattered, but matter wasn't God. We had a motivation to learn in the tension between the divine and the material. And it's out of this wondering that robust arts and sciences could come for all of eternity. So here's my kind of commercial about what we should do. What we need are wonderful schools everywhere. This is the moment for Orthodoxy to save liberal arts education. We invented it, we sustained it, we passed it on to the West. The West has managed to botch it up and cause people to borrow $100,000 and teach falsehoods and mess up. There's still a lot of good professors out there, obviously, but the system's in decline. And the same thing is true too often with K through 12. A wonderful school is a gift of the Holy Spirit, and we do his work. We do God's work. We have our unique place, just as the emperor came to have a unique place inside the Byzantine Commonwealth. Someone asked me once, why did we name the school St. Constantine? And there are lots and lots of reasons. A bad reason is it seemed to irritate all the people that are fun to irritate. But the second and better reason, there are many good reasons, but the second and better reason I'll talk about tonight is that we hope to produce a republic of Constantine and Helens. In the ancient world, we needed someone who could live in the tension and see outside the box. If you were called to be a Roman emperor, and Rome, which is an arbitrarily placed city, is no longer defensible or affordable, how can you be Roman emperor and survive? Constantine somehow wonderfully, miraculously, saw that you could be emperor of the Romans without living in Rome. That there could be a new Rome, the city, and that city could be put in a place that was economically sufficient, that made money, and that was defensible. As a result, he bought 1,000 years for general Roman civilization. In the same way, he saw that the religion that had been at least lightly persecuted for hundreds of years could become a prop and stay, an organizing principle for the world. In other words, he saw what no one else could see, what is simple to see once someone sees it. Now imagine Orthodox schools all over the world producing now in our different context, a kind of republic of Constantine and Helens, a republic of people who see things in a new way, who know how to defend old verities by thinking outside of old boxes, who do not simply succumb to the world, the flesh, and the devil and call it education, but also do not mindlessly repeat things. This is the tension and the glory, I think, of Orthodox education. And I hope I got you a little excited about it and didn't cause too many problems for his grace. But I'd love to take questions from this kind of smart group. I know we have a good amount of time to do that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Reynolds, for your presentation. So if you have questions, if you would enter those in the chat box, and down at the bottom of your screen, if you put your mouse on the screen, you'll see the option for chat. If you click on that, you can type your message in there to everyone, and we will work through that. Dr. Reynolds, probably the most pressing question that we have right now is, how old is your puppy?
Our puppy, who is supposed to be small, is 7 months old. We've had him for 4 weeks, and he is awesome. He's part lab, and they told us boxer, but that's, of course, what they tell you when he has a little bit of pit bull, or she has a little bit of pit bull. But she is so sweet. So, Hope, can you come and say hello to everyone? This is my wife, Hope, is the first lady. You can see her, and you can see, here is Nessie, far more attractive, both Hope and the puppy. No, now the puppy can't be seen. If you go backwards a little bit, I will try to get out of the way. Hooray! Nessie will do absolutely no tricks other than be adorable. She loves everyone. As a guard dog, she would be very marginal. She is giving new life to our 19-year-old cat, Athena, who is getting very cranky and now can torture Nessie all the time. And it's given her new life. I'm afraid she's like that cranky parishioner some of you have, who get new life when they can find somebody to give a hard time. So the wonder cat Athena gives Nessie a hard time.
All right, we do have a couple questions coming in addition to pet questions. First one is what is the financial model supporting the school system there in Houston? How do you fund this?
That's a good question. I mean, there are two different things to a financial model like this. One is startup, which is obviously very donor dependent. But I'm a big fan of getting things that don't become donor dependent. This fall will be about 60% tuition driven. But think about it. I'm charging $9,000 for a fully accredited baccalaureate degree. That's the whole year of tuition. Now, my college teachers, how can I afford to offer a baccalaureate degree and hire professors? Because from the nursery all the way through the college, people teach at every level of the school, so you get economy of scale. Often small high schools, for example, will have to have one really good scientist to kind of lead things. In our high school, we have Dr. Augustus. She is a biologist with a PhD from Rice, just an excellent scientist, and was a real leader in the community, and came to work for us because she had taken some time to homeschool her kids and realized I should just homeschool my kids at St. Constantine and be part of the community here. Notice she can, instead of having her here and paying her a full-time salary and not having enough for her to do, she can teach the general education elective for our science program in the college. So we have too much for her to do. And we have had people lead sessions. I have done a session, I think, in 7th grade, high school, and I mostly teach inside the college. And so you get economy of scale that way. We have no full-time employees who do not teach, with one exception. We have one administrator, Angie Dorset, who does scheduling for us right now, but she's a house head. She does discipline for the K through 12, but she didn't teach a class last term. So we only have one employee who doesn't teach. A lot of what you would call back office work are done by our adult college students who then get paid. So how much does it cost you to go to the College of St. Constantine? Many of our students make more money than they pay. So the financial model ultimately should run in the black if we continue at the great rate of growth that we're going. And that's about a 10-year process, Deacon David. I'm happy to be as disclosing about that sort of thing as you want. But obviously that means very thoughtful, generous people in Houston have given us the trajectory to take off. Now, it could have been done differently. We had people that wanted us to, we started with 115 students. And if we had done it efficiently, we would have started with very few students and hired very few people. But through the generosity of wonderful men and women of God in the churches in our area, we were able to start off kind of larger. We were K through 13 the first year.
Wow.
But I wouldn't, unless you had that kind of funding, you could start off much smaller. You wouldn't have to start. We have about 60 faculty members.
So here's kind of a shift in the opposite direction. What are things to look for when looking for a school when or if there are no Orthodox options around you?
So first, we should start Orthodox schools. There's my commercial. But I will start at a college level, and then I will work my way down. First of all, you should realize that any private school may close within the next decade. And no one's going to tell you that when you apply, because college is big business. I was the chief academic officer of a school. And so the first question to ask is the school what its discount rate is. Very key term. That is not what they charge for tuition, but what they're budgeted to get per each student. That will tell you two things. One, whether you're getting ripped off. Most scholarships that people get are marketing maneuvers. For example, there's a well-known school in our area, I've never worked for it, in Texas, that gives a free ride through a scholarship competition, like an essay competition. The truth is they're going to give two people a free ride. Everybody else is going to get some version of the same financial aid they would have gotten anyway. But if you think you've won a prize, you're more likely to come. And so the discount rate tells you roughly what they think they're going to give you anyway. And if the discount rate is consistently over 50%, your school is really wobbly. and it's a bad idea to go to a really wobbly school. Now, obviously, as a startup, we're only at 60-40. So that's a different circumstance. The second question to ask is, how much do you want your kid to be a Christian? As far as I can tell, the best outcome for sending your kid to a non-Christian college that I have found, like from Fuller, is about 50-50. So I'm not talking about grad school here, which is very professional, like med school, things like that. I'm talking about undergraduate education. Has a very toxic effect on people's faith lives. I'm not saying that because I'm just the way it is. I've seen numbers as high as 80%, but I suspect it's somewhere around, 50, 40 to 80%, somewhere in there. It's very hard to track. It used to be that kids would come back to church after college, like they'd wander away from the faith, and it was called the snapback theory of what would occur. Texas Baptists have been doing it for a century. But because most people don't get married anymore until their late 20s, often early 30s, the normal family formation and things, by the time they would even think about coming back to the church, they've been long gone. And so education has a secularizing effect. So you have to ask this question. One, at a college level, is there a church with a vibrant college ministry that I immediately get my kid connected to? Second, is there a mentor in the major that my kid is going to be in who is some kind of Christian that I can hook my kid up with? Because you don't have to go to a Christian college. You don't have to go to college at St. Constantine. We only ever went to have 50 at our particular campus. So it's not like I'm trying to recruit. You're welcome to come. Your kids are welcome to come. But if you can find a mentor inside the faith in their major, a medical doctor, their pre-med, and a medical doctor, particularly who's Orthodox, or a medical doctor who's at least a traditional believer that agrees with your values, you'll be okay. So that's the second thing I would do, because many so-called Christian colleges are equally toxic, right? They're Christian in name only. So can you find a mentor, Obi-Wan to Luke, Yoda, so whatever mentor fits for you, whatever analogy. And then the third thing is to read the papers produced by the psychology or sociology department, because that will tell you, look up the papers of the people who write in those departments, because that will tell you kind of the center of gravity there, and then decide what it is you can accept. Notice I'm not suggesting you should go to like FundU and we should all be fundamentalists. I'm just saying, since I cared about my kids being Christian, I wanted to maximize the chances of that and give them a really good education. I went to a really good school and had really good mentors, and it was helpful. And so my parents did a good job with this. And I didn't only go to Christian colleges, obviously, mostly did not. So this can be done. At a K through 12 level, which is probably really where people were talking, the same. It's basically, leaving the financial piece out because most of you won't be paying. Is there a mentor? I know this sounds really simple. The most influential people in your life are the person who mentors you, not necessarily the classroom teacher, certainly not the president, unless they happen to be mentoring. So who will be mentoring your child? Now, for small children, it's usually the single classroom teacher, particularly at a private school. So who is that person? What are their values? Because those will be your kid's values. You can't have your kid getting values from someone and then take a look at the value statement of the school. What does it say? My daughter, when we moved to Texas, was the last one that's still being homeschooled, and she decided she wanted to go to the local government school. And Texas schools are pretty okay. Lots of Christians who work in them, but she actually personally read the value statement for the school, and she wasn't interested in it. That isn't the place she wanted to be. So look at the value statement. Most schools will tell you roughly what they intend to do. Go on the St. Constantine website and you can read our value statement. Do we always live up to our value statement? Sadly, no, because we're imperfect human beings, but at least you know what we're shooting for, right? It's our goal. And if you take a look at the value statement and say, man, I'm going to be fighting with the teacher all the time, that's a bad idea. But look, whether it's public school, government school, or whether it's private school, there are people who have not bowed the knee to Baal, found all over the place. I'm not a depressive. I don't think we need to hide. So I would either look for a public school where there's somebody who can mentor your child or high school student, a coach if they're athletically inclined, a theater teacher if they're into that sort of thing. My wife, this is being recorded, so I'm going to say this in a very careful way, had a very difficult home when she was small. My two brothers-in-law lived with us through high school. I was the only 22-year-old with a son on a high school basketball team. Her music teacher, and this happened to be at a Christian school, an evangelical Christian school, where we met in 10th grade. Her music teacher saved her life by being a mentor and role model and kind of dad figure. And so that's a very extreme case, but that's what you're looking for when you look for a school, because otherwise you've wasted your money. School is about mentoring in a very fundamental way. The other thing I'll say about elementary school, we started a college, you can think of St. Constantine, because we'd been running one. Why did we start a high school? We were tired of lousy high school students. Then we started a junior high because we realized that we were getting lousy junior high students. Then we started an elementary school. And the biggest problems we found in elementary school is kids are worked too hard. So look for a place that has active recess and no homework so that kids can be involved in the life of the church as small children. There shouldn't be much or any homework up through about 5th or 6th grade.
So let me...
I'm sorry, these are very general statements. I could try to... You can go on the website and we'll give you reasons for all these things.
Excellent. So one question is if you would share your perspective on the pros and cons of online education as opposed to on-the-ground education, and particularly in our current context with the finishing the year with the COVID, at-home schooling and not sure what the future is.
I mean, sure, we had to finish online-ish like everyone else at St. Constantine. And I want to say, I started an online homeschool program called Torrey Academy, which lasted 20 years. The evangelical school that founded it decided to close it for guessable reasons. The second thing I did is took HBU online, helped them develop online classes. So online has a place. There is a place for online, particularly in college education, because we could get Bishop Thomas to come and talk to our students about something important without his having to fly here. And I think board meetings are better on Zoom. I can play Star Trek Timeline during the board game on my phone and nobody knows, and then make comments. I'm being only kidding a little, but I am kidding. So there are things that online does very well. We have a profoundly blind student in the college, and I think he benefited from online classes. There are techniques that we learned in the online class that I think he benefited from that we'll use with classes that are on the campus. We'll help him use some of the online tools that we found for him. So that was a good thing. Mostly, however, if you listen to what I said about education, I said education is wonder, right? And wonder begins in beauty, which causes what to rise up in our souls? Love. And here's the truth. When I loved Hope, we didn't have Zoom, so I ran up huge phone bills. It was before phone was free because she was in Illinois in college and I was in upstate New York. But no one in love would ever want to be online because there's nothing like being there. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean anything like if Jesus were in Charleston, which sometimes people in West Virginia think he is, but if Jesus were in Charleston, most of us wouldn't want to Zoom in with him. We would make a pilgrimage as quickly as possible to Charleston. If you agree with everything I just said, it's pretty abstract and philosophical, but I wanted to lay the groundwork for some of what I'm saying. education cannot fundamentally be done online. Information distribution, which is some of what I've done, can be done online. But it would matter to you, if you were sitting here in class with me, you would be able to look down and see that Nessie sits under my desk and for most of the class was there. You'd hear the cuckoo clock. I generally have a candle burning. That is different because it's incarnate. And so there's some things we can do, credentialing, information distribution. Thank God for Zoom during a pandemic. But I don't think education on the whole can be done online. I think that is credentialing. Is there anything wrong with credentialing, by the way? No, it's very valuable. We need it. Online can be a really good way to get credentialing done. But if you find a mentor, the person who taught me Greek and was most important to me in learning the dialectic, a student of Leo Strauss's, flew down to see me every year until he died, and my students. And he would lead discussions in his 80s for 30 hours at a time. Don't you wish you could have gone? I wish I could have class with him again. And I miss him. And he had a massive heart attack and had 1/3 lung capacity. So we would use Skype and he would teach 30 hours of Plato over a weekend to our students at St. Constantine. But it wasn't the same. It was good. It was better if that's all we could do. And that was all we could do. I'd gladly do that now if I could. And then he slipped the surly bonds of earth. But I think if we love our mentor, we would want to be with them. And I think essentially education is discipleship. Again, I'm not talking about credentialing or job training. That those are two entirely different things. And lots of that can be done online. And I'm not opposed to or snobby about either of those things. Both credentialing and job training are vital. Our students will go get jobs. They read well, write well, and think well.
So I want to pick up three comments that are made here and tie those together. During this COVID-19 time, you know, as the schools around the country were sent home.
Can I just pause, Deacon David? There's something
Yes.
really intimidating. I am now talking to all the Antiochian women of the East. I have this image. No, I'm sorry, I'm not giving whoever it is a hard time. I can just tell you my image is there are like hundreds of saints stretching backwards from the black screen into time and eternity. So I feel like I should say something much better than I've said. This is kind of an intimidating group. On the other hand, iPad 4 is not so hard. I can handle Apple products pretty well. But yeah. The Antiochian of the East, that's an intimidating group. Anyway, I'm sorry, Deacon.
Yes. No, so we've all discovered with kids coming home, and it's been interesting to listen to teachers, some that I'm related to and others connected to in other ways, reflect on what a challenge it has been for both the teacher who is not used to teaching online to have to teach yes. online, for the student and the parents who are at home who are not used to learning through an online medium and feeling like it was kind of a big waste of time. On the one hand, some teachers talking about how stressed they are about trying to convert everything. Others teachers saying, you know, just relax. I mean, let's just get through the year. It doesn't really matter anyway. And then, you know, in between those two spectrums. And one of my sons actually has been in an online charter school as well. And your statement about education fundamentally can't be done online, but information transfer can, is exactly what I've been seeing myself. There can be a transfer of information. You can test on the transfer of information, but the actual education is often lacking. So there are some.
For that reason, Deacon, a good experience with our college students, because as mature adults, we had established such a long-term relationship with them that we coasted those 6 weeks on that relationship. So I don't think our college classes got in one way much worse. But I sent a bunch of high school boys home and told them to be online all day.
Mm.
And so we got away from that as quickly as we could. I'm not going to tell you accounts, and it is even what you think. Everybody always thinks of like evil things or sin. I'm talking about people who couldn't resist gaming all the time.
Right.
Or I have high school students that are news junkies, and we're in a presidential election year, and so they just sat and so forget all the evil things. Yes, that was a big problem too, but I didn't so much have to deal with that. I'm sure confessors and priests had to deal with that. We won't do it again. So let's assume there's a second round of the pandemic and we are shelter in place. We're coming up with creative solutions that will use online for information distribution, but will find incarnate ways to teach. Even if we do, this is going to sound really absurd, Deacon, we're working on the equivalent of a drive-in movie for classes. Houston has lots and lots of parking lots, and we're surrounded by them. And cars are insulated and contain still mostly radios, and tech like phones would enable us to Bluetooth speakers or stream a live presentation and also deal with people with good social distancing. I doubt we do kind of classical Zoom classes for K through 12 the same way. We'll try to use our playground. We know more about the virus now, right? We know what is very dangerous, and since not very dangerous for small children, we'll try to do things that are active play for small children. Our playground is intentionally what's called a natural playground. It doesn't contain any metal or plastic, basically. It's all wood. We teach kids to climb trees and do things like that. You can take a look at the campus. And so that's pretty safe. And so we'll probably do something with that because we did the best we could. And I have a brilliant group of teachers, really brilliant group of teachers. I taught gifted and talented students for decades. I have former students who teach at Baylor places. And my favorite students and my favorite people I've run into in education are at our school. And we did the best we could. They did the best they could. They were the leaders. And we wouldn't do it again the way we did.
Yeah. So we have a couple questions in regard to the forming of satellite campuses. You talked about the desire to see that happen through St. Constantine. I know you're working with startup groups and other here in Pennsylvania as well at looking at using that. There's a second part to another question. One comment was that we need more churches as well as schools, and is there a way to have a mission and a school start together? Is your model scalable? What does that look like?
Yeah, it is, but now I'll say something. This is my opinion, right? I'm not a bishop. Nobody has to do anything I say, and I have a particular take on the way the world should go, right? To do what the bishop says. But I think on the whole, notice why I tried to trace out all this history so that what I'm about to say is less controversial. I think the parish day school model is not authentic to the East, and that schools should be standalone and related to parishes, but not parish schools. In other words, what I've seen time and time again, both in Catholic and evangelical schools, where there are large numbers, and I can generalize. There's so few Orthodox schools, you can't generalize outside of the Greek community. And I don't know that community as well as I would like. But you see a tension between Sunday school, which is not the same ministry as Monday school, utilizing the space and wanting it for their purposes, and Monday school, and the tensions that result. They're not the same ministries. If you have a calling to that, people are redeemed by religious education inside the church. That's not the calling of a Christian school. So could somebody come and plant both things simultaneously and they would grow up together? Yes, but I'd suggest they should be two separate 501c3s and two separate boards. Now let me caution you about one of two things, and depending on your inclination, you'll worry about more than one than the other. I hate the hijacking of Christian schools by secular people who then secularize them and turn them into college prep places for rich people.
Right.
So that is a danger. So having active religious advising and a very tight bylaws statement that says, this is an Orthodox school, this is what Orthodoxy is. We minister to everybody. I mean, obviously in a city like Houston, 80% of our students are not Orthodox. And it has to be that way. Right? Every Orthodox kid in town could come by the time we were full grown, and it would be 80% not Orthodox. So we're ministering to everybody. I have several atheist kids from China that were in the high school this year. And they went to chapel, and they know the creed. And they heard me discuss things with them, and they have different views than when they started. They still aren't Christians as far as I know, but I don't know, right? Who can see someone's heart? So yes, you can do it that way. I think it's even a good idea because notice, again, I realize I kept it at this level on purpose because now if I say something like this, I hope it will make sense. I think the formation of what amounts to an Orthodox village is a great idea. But notice, I am not saying to be cut off from the world. Anybody who's visited the school knows we intentionally placed ourselves in an extraordinarily urban area, a densely populated, enormously diverse area. I have, these are offensive phrases in one way, I'm sorry about it. There's what is called the Mahatma Gandhi district over here, what is called Little China. I vote in a Vietnamese refugee center, and my neighborhood has no majority of any kind. I live across from the school because I'm all in. Our college students live in this neighborhood too. So we are not hiding from anything, right? We're involved in the life of our community, but we also want a full-orbed Orthodox experience because scientists aren't priests. I mean, sometimes they are. I'm a philosopher, not a pastor. I'm a teacher, a college professor, not a pastor, but we need good pastors. And so having our good pastors telling us what to do and they should do, I don't decide what chapel looks like in the morning at all. I have nothing to do with it except find a place for it. And that's the tension I'm talking about. This is not the Catholic parochial day school model that evangelicals simply ported over. If you want to know the result of this, by the way, go look up on Twitter of hashtag #exevangelical, hashtag #exevangelical, or hashtag that sort of thing, evangelical schools or Catholic schools. What you can see is it's too pervasive. It's like a theocracy. On the other hand, Christian schools in name only, where you're taking parents' money and it's just utterly secular, that's the bigger danger. And that's the thing I worry about because that happens far more frequently. We're far less likely to become fundamentalists than we are to become worthlessly content free. And God forgive us. I had parents come in and say, I won't say their religious background. And they said, oh, we love your school. They listen to a pitch like this, and I have a secular version of the talk, but it's basically the same. And they're from a very highly educated community in the medical district. And they said, great, we don't mind chapel. This is all good. We'll send our kids. Because the good news is Christianity doesn't intrude itself into like history class or into math class or into science class, right? That's just all neutral. And I said, look, it doesn't intrude in a fundamentalist way. Calculus is calculus, but our math teacher will pause and start talking about the reality of numbers and what that has to do with metaphysics, and you'll learn really good calculus, but we're pervasively Christian. They didn't come, and that was a lot of money. They were full pay parents that would have tapped into a whole community of full pay parents. We were just too Christian. Another group of Baptist people came in and said, man, there are icons everywhere, in every room. Can we just not have icons in every room? And what I said to them was, well, we're just not the school for you. Like, it's Houston. There are like a jillion Baptist schools, and I was the chief academic officer of one. Go be warm and comforted. There won't be icons anyplace but my office when I worked there. So we do that, but we're not a church either. So for example, do we have Bible class, strictly speaking? No. If you ever sent your kid to a Christian school, you'll know that Bible class was the blow-off class at that school, that people didn't take seriously, or some youth pastor came in. They're almost more harmful than not. What we do is we integrate religious content all the way through. So I have the only 2 Mormon students as little kids that can do the whole morning prayer service and can repeat the Nicene Creed. Now, if I were a Mormon parent, would I want my kid doing that? Probably not, but they're happy, great parents. So, okay. But we are who we are, right? And we're authentically Christian all the time. So if you're reading great books, we are one of the few great books programs in the world that would read the Eastern Fathers. But we don't read them in a special class, right? Oh, we're all going to leave. We've been reading Plato, but now we're going to read Gregory, and we're going to go off into the religious room and separate the 2 things. That's extraordinarily toxic to a kid or to a college student, by the way. You know, oh, look, I took 30 units of Bible, the evangelical college will say. No, everybody went and did 30 units of Bible they thought had nothing to do with anything they were going to do in the real world.
Yeah. Sadna, I believe you had a comment you were going to make.
Yes. You know, I visited St. Constantine's School on a number of occasions. I was supposed to visit twice this year because of this virus. I have not been able to go. The question that was asked talked about church and mission and the school developing simultaneously. I think St. Constantine could only be St. Constantine and be what it is now because it started in a mode of catechesis. Dr. Reynolds told you that I think he said 80% of the students are not Orthodox, but the school is extremely Orthodox. And I've told him when I visited the school that eventually it'll probably be a good idea that there's a church next door because it's the beginning of Neo-Vesilata. It's the beginning of a community, a Christian community. There may be a school there, maybe there'll be a doctor's office, a hospital, who knows? But its beginnings had to do with bringing people to the church in a way that they could, in a palatable way. And, you know, Doctor mentioned about icons. Do there have to be so many icons in the room? We have a monastery in Florida, in Ocala, Florida. It's under the Greek Archdiocese. When I was a priest in Florida, I was there when the monastery began, and there was the abbess was a monastic by the name of Mother Ephemia, and I used to go there visit regularly. And after about maybe I'd gone for 2 months, she grabbed me by the hand. She said, "Father," she says, "you have to help us. We have some very poor people here as our neighbors." So I have a secular mind. I said, "Well, whatever they need food, they need money." She says, "No, these people are very poor." She says, "They're called Baptists." She says, "You go to their church and the only thing they have is a cross and a Bible." She says, "There's no icons." She didn't know anything about the Baptist church. She says, "There's no icons." She says, "They don't have the Eucharist." She says, "These people are very poor. We have to bring the church to them." And we discussed how we could do it in such a way that, we wouldn't frighten them or scare them away, do it in a way that was palatable to that area. One of the questions I saw pop up on the screen is how many Orthodox schools are there in this country and who do they belong to? I visited some. There's actually about 80 schools that refer to themselves as Orthodox schools in this country. I visited some of them. I can tell you that some of them you would not know they were Orthodox except for their name. They're private schools. They have an icon at the door and they have an Orthodox name. And they do that because, as a matter of fact, they're not there in the spirit of evangelization. They're there because, as a matter of fact, they want to bring the children to a place that they feel will be safe, but they'll get a good education, but somehow will not offend. There are schools such as St. Constantine that are extremely Orthodox, but they've grown into that. So I think it's important, if we're going to start satellite schools, and I hope to have a couple at least. We're talking about 5 in our diocese. That, as a matter of fact, we look at the area that we're in. The number one purpose of the school should be evangelize, but look at what's going to be the most effective way to do it, and to develop on the model that St. Constantine's developed, because it's been extremely successful. I taught public school and I taught in private school in my previous life, and I have never been to a place like St. Constantine. All the schools that I taught in, there was a good number of people that didn't want to be there. I mean, for one reason or another, they didn't want to be there. You go to St. Constantine, everybody wants to be there. The doctor told you everybody teaches. The students want to be there, the administrators want to be there, and the teachers want to be there. And they want to be there because they're there as a family with a common purpose, coming closer to God. And so I would hope if there are people listening that are thinking about teaching or being part of a school that is a traditional Christian school, you look very closely at the model that Dr. Reynolds and his staff has created, and it would behoove you to clone it. And when I say clone it, not to do everything exactly the way they do, but do it for the purpose, the purpose of evangelizing and spreading good news in a language that will be understandable, palatable to the people that are living in that area.
That's why, as apologetic as I am, and hopefully, thank you, Your Grace, there will be an ability to look at it again. But I wanted to lay down what I think is the philosophical lessons from the church that make us different than anyone else, so that you don't have to be us. You know, every area has its own thing, but it's this wonderful tension of our beautiful two-headed eagle, where we're always in dialogue, but we're one body and we're faithful. So often people go awry in their schools because they're either lifeless rote, here's the truth, and they lifelessly, they don't know how to apply it to the world we live in. Truth doesn't change, but the application might. On the other hand, I think the greater danger is what our bishop was telling us, which is that we lose all Christian content whatsoever. In other words, in the tension between Athens and Jerusalem, that St. Basil, and we cannot read St. Basil too often if we're starting Christian schools. We cannot read St. Basil too often. We cannot read St. Basil too often. But this blessed tension that he talks about, these images of truth that one can find, that's how we keep from going wrong this way.
Dr. John Mark, what is the name of was it a homily or a treatise?
You know, this is really terrible after I tell you to read it. It's something like a sermon to young men going to school. If somebody finds it exactly by Googling it, they could tell me.
Okay.
It's exceedingly short, but it is so profound that I think that if I read it every day of my life, I would come up with a new idea based on it. It is just jam-packed with educational truth. And I swear to you, there's a straight line from that sermon to Oxford.
So following up,
it's not hard, right?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's not hard to see, right? St. Basil, much to everyone's shock, is utterly faithful in advocating liturgical orthodoxy and the formation through catechesis in the church, and then is also sending young men off to wrestle with Homer and Plato by name. in the sermon and telling them how to do that. And so this great champion of orthodoxy is also bringing forward the best of the pagan world. Here, I hate this. If anyone says that the church is opposed to education, we would have no pagans to read. My PhD would have been impossible if the church hadn't saved these texts. We saved them because we learned from them. And so this great champion of orthodoxy somehow images how to do this without becoming liberal or faithless or apostate. I'm no saint, so it's much harder for me. But what a wonderful, glorious image. And see, notice then this classical Christian education is less carefully imitated. Augustine of blessed memory wrote a book called On Christian Teaching, which is in many ways similar, but I would advocate to you comparing On Christian Teaching to St. Basil, and you will see how Basil got something gloriously right, that Augustine, his vision is a little crabby. It's a little more narrow, a little more defensive. I'm sorry, Deacon, you got me on a rant.
No, that's okay. We have, maybe another 10 minutes to go here, and there's a couple of questions in regards to our children going to other schools. Let me just read this to you. The biggest challenge we are facing now is once our kids go to college, they start thinking in a different way and start gradually to be away from the church, even the ones who stay in church. They don't want to attend conferences. They just come to hang out with friends. The question is how to change the way we discuss religion with them and to be able to bring them back to the church as believers. And I'll pair another question with that. And there's been a couple reflecting on the experience of their children going to Catholic colleges, Catholic in quotes in the question, Catholic colleges and universities, and essentially coming away without a faith, even though they went to a Christian university. So this experience of them leaving, how do we?
The bishop is not responsible for my opinion. In this dark age, where I believe the spirit of Antichrist is particularly abroad, it is very, very difficult to go to a secular college and keep the faith. Therefore, if one can avoid it, one should, but one cannot assume in this Antichrist age that things labeled Christian are any better, which is why I tried to spend some time both in the talk talking about, I wouldn't send my kid to fundamentalist U. You want to meet atheists? I mean, scratch an atheist that I dialogue online, and it's a Baptist minister's son. It sounds like a joke, but it was common enough that, so can you find this mentor, this person that will help? Now, suppose there aren't options and people don't want to send their kid to Christian college, and what I'm saying sounds too extreme. And remember, part of college in the United States became job training after 1945. So the mentoring part of it, you could do in a Christian context. I just sent a kid to Rice. If you want to go be an engineer, go to Rice and learn to be an engineer, and then we'll mentor you in the sort of way to look at the humanities, the way to look at ethics, and the way to look at philosophy. I'm not going to start an engineering program that's fourth rate when I'm sitting next to one of the best engineering programs in my region, right? I'm going to start an opera program, but I have someone who sings or sang for the Royal Opera who's a former student who did the lead in Bohème here at the Houston Grand. Katie Van Coten, look up her IMDb page. But when she was in London singing opera, she was able to retain her faith because she knew how to dialogue, work through the dialectic with, she was probably the only straight woman in a 3-block area for a little while. It was a very difficult circumstance for her as a traditional Christian. Not all my students have done well. Most of them have. When an honors college student goes bad, they go really bad. You've taught them to think well, and that's fine. I mean, so what do you do with students You have to send them to a secular school. They get lots of this. We need to set up some of our Christian education by profession. For some reason, I think often modeling after our evangelical friends, we set up education by age. But most people in the United States today are mentored and work with people of a common profession. So if a kid can come home and we can find a faithful Orthodox medical doctor to talk with and dialogue with our pre-med students, and we have engineers who've been in the faith for a while, and they talk to our pre-engineering students. We have people in the humanities, let's say, who really care about English, who can sit down and say, okay, you're working your way through Foucault. Great, there's a lot to learn from Foucault. We're not going to freak out and scream and run around in a circle. What have you learned? And let's have a dialogue about it. And you'll often find people want to return to their childhood training. They're not jerks, but they need to see that they can be an Orthodox Christian and live faithfully what they've learned in school. And what we can't do, some of my greatest mentors were atheists. What we can't do is pretend that you're going to go to grad school and people are going to persecute you for your faith. What was difficult for me was everybody just expected me to outgrow my faith. They liked me. They say, oh, great, we're glad you're here. We like your parents. We like the way you grew up. Hooray for you. Now, here's the way it really is if you're smart like we are. Mm. And we think you are smart like we are. I was TAing for the president of the University of Rochester, and he said, look, if you keep up the way you're going, you'll never get a job anywhere but like a Bible school. And that would be a great shame. So you need to mellow out. And I'd like to tell you that when he said that to me in the faculty club as his TA, that I leapt to my feet and, sang, "We have seen the true light" or something, and got an icon and was faithful. But mostly what I thought was, I really like faculty clubs. I really like being a philosopher, and I really would like a job. And I'm not inclined to work at a Bible college. And so that wasn't fun. If you'd been mean to me, I was ready for that, right? Yeah. I made it. I haven't had to live through much of that. So we need to find people that can mentor students. Here's my fear. I'm afraid that a lot of priests just don't ask their kids what they think because they're involved in don't ask, don't tell, and their kid is entirely secular in their worldview. And if they can get them to come to church sometime and not freak their parents out, everybody just hopes it'll all go away. Mm. But I can tell you what will all go away, their children. Mm-hmm. So you might keep somebody out of kind of good filial bonding, who is in their heart not Orthodox, but we may have to get smaller before we get larger. And I have 4 kids. Not all my kids agree with me on everything. It's a tough world that we live in. But you have to maximize the probability that your kids will do well if we care about the faith, right? I told you is and ought. If the most important thing is the transmission of the faith once delivered to the apostles, then we know what will increase the probability of that occurring. They're just facts about that. But that may not be the most important thing. I have to tell you this when I talk to parents, whether they're Catholic or evangelical, I'm talking very religious parents. The minute I get to college, do you know what they care about? Homeschool parents. Homeschool moms were told by their mother-in-law that homeschooling was a big mistake and that their kids would be dolts. And then the kid gets into Harvard, this is a real instance, and the mom is vindicated. Now, the fact that the kid never goes to church again, having homeschooled them for 12 years, is, I guess, incidental because the mother's heart was in being vindicated, not in fact in producing a child that would be faithful in the church. Now, I'll tell you this about my dad, who is better than I am. He's 82 years old. Every year, we would ask my dad what he wanted for Christmas. And every year, it was a big joke in some ways, he would say, 2 boys who serve the Lord. And here's what I knew about my dad. He didn't care if we got rich. He didn't care if we got famous. He didn't care if we went to college. He wanted us to know and love Jesus. And so I am not kidding. I had a horrible early 20s. the black sheep of the family. My brother is very virtuous. But that was hard to deal with. When I wanted to leave the faith, when I was in a philosophy department trying to leave the faith, my dad was hard to deal with, not because I couldn't beat him in an argument, but because he was absolutely sincere and good and smart. And I knew what he really wanted. So a lot of us say we want something, but if our kid had a lower standard of living because they were faithful and the HR department didn't give them a promotion, we'd really wish they changed their mind. Mm. And you can't lie to your children about this. They'll know what's true of us. And so I use my dad as an image because he was a better dad than I was a dad, which is a shame, but the truth.
So we have...
I'm responsible for anything I say. I'm not a pastor, you guys are. Matthew's iPhone.
We have several more questions that have come in, and we're kind of up against the time here as well. So rapid answers, and then we'll ask Sedna to close us in prayer with a blessing. First of all,
no.
If people are okay. That was quick. If people are interested in getting in touch with you to talk about how to start a school, there's some interest in that. Is it okay if on the information we send out, they have your email address? Is that the best way to reach you?
Yeah, what they should do is don't send me email, because between atheists who send me hateful email about how I am a bad person for being a Christian and everything, my email box can get clogged. Send an email to A. Dorset, who handles my email. That's A. Dorset, DORSETT, at stconstantine.org, and she'll get us together. We were going to have what's called Vision 2020 conference in July, and it was moved to next year. And Vision 2020 conference, which will have like Frederica Matthews Green, and my friend Paul Barnes is going to do a glass concert for us. And so lots of the arts, because it should be full of beauty and wisdom. And I will talk both practically and abstractly about how to start a school, as will the team here. And that will be in 2021, God willing, God in the pandemic willing, because we do have a lot of people who want to visit. And so we thought we'd put together an entire conference, and it was going to be in a month. And now it's not going to be, for obvious reasons.
Okay, wonderful.
But now I don't have to do the same talk because I just gave it to you.
What month of next year are you thinking that would be in?
Oh, it will almost surely be in July, given the school's calendar.
Okay.
Let me say something, and there's a reason why I did what I did tonight carefully. Mm-hmm. We do not do one thing at St. Constantine that we know to be foreign to Orthodox tradition. We want to be organically out of Orthodox tradition. And sometimes when people see classical Christian Orthodox school, they think that we're a Roman Catholic school that borrowed stuff. Hmm. But they borrowed from us. That's what I tried to show. Two, we're very different. The things I talked about tonight make big differences. So, for example, just the relationship we have with our parishes is different than a parochial school model. We're with. With is different than under. Think of the relationship between the emperor and the patriarch. That's the relationship between a Christian school and a parish. Sort of, right?
In conflict all the time, is that what you mean?
Somebody dies, and yeah, I know that's the problem. Sometimes it works, right? Tension isn't always bad, but quick.
Okay, so one final question. How do you, in the St. Constantine model, involve parents in the education of their children?
Oh, that's a great question, because if you look at the history that I just outlined for you, for most kids, who are the primary teachers?
Mom and dad.
Not the priest, right? That's not the model. Not a secular teacher. Most people weren't rich. There would be a local pedagogue who'd teach you how to read, and the parents would give what they could towards it. A little bit, the one room schoolhouse is in the Western American tradition, the closest you'd come to this. So in West Virginia, my grandfather, who got to go to the 8th grade twice because he was really smart, in Goose Creek, West Virginia, and he called it Goose Creek U. But that was really very much an Eastern Orthodox way of doing things, right? It was sort of churchy. It wasn't controlled by the government, but the parents kind of set it up and ran it. And because there were Adventists and Methodists and Baptists there, the separation of church and state in a West Virginia 1 through 8 meant you went to everybody's revival. So each church would have a revival service, and you got dismissed to go to all of them because otherwise it would be sectarian. So that was the separation of church and state. It's that kind of model that's organic. And so parents at our school are the primary teachers. I work for the parents. Now, in terms of, religious orthodoxy, I work for the priests in a sense, but I work for the parents more than the board. I mean, it's Bo, right? Bo Branson there, sitting there. Is it a UCLA t-shirt? No. Oh, Chicago. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Anyway, I work for the parents. Parents are always the primary teachers of minor children. And then even when they're adults, they're not particularly called to honor me, but we try to inculcate honor for the parents so that they can live long on the face of the earth. You are the primary teacher for your children. I work for you. Mm. It's what homeschooling became. I think the rise of homeschooling has substituted for the failure of the Orthodox community to produce schools that are authentically Orthodox, where parents have power. So, for example, we meet 3 days a week for certain classes, 2 days a week for certain classes, but we have parents who take as few as 1 class from us and homeschool their kids in the rest. Or they might take 5 classes from us and homeschool their kid in something else. Or, God help us, there are parents who are very ill where we take on even more of the load than a school would normally take. But who do we work for? Mom and dad, more than anyone. More than anyone. The danger to this, though, is this, and Bishop Thomas would be upset if I didn't say this. Parents are often corrupt in this sense. They have adopted a worldly view of what education should produce, that is wealth and getting along in America as it is today, either conservative or liberal or whatever, just get along, and not authentic orthodoxy. And so in that sense, sometimes you'll run into tensions with parents. Can we get you into Rice? Yes, we've done so. Is that our goal? No, we want to make whole souls that are virtuous for the saints for the kingdom of God. We ourselves are failing at that task of becoming saints for the kingdom of God. So I'll end. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner.
Thank you, Dr. John Mark. I'm sorry if I skipped over any of the questions there. Right before we wrap up, though, with Bishop Thomas, I want to remind you that tomorrow evening we'll be back together at 7 p.m. with the topic of the discussion is baptizing all nations in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And this workshop is going to be focused on the evangelization of our urban areas, led by Father Paul Abernathy, who's the parish priest at St. Moses, the Black Mission in the historic Hill District of Pittsburgh, along with Father Martin Johnson, Deacon Joseph Clark, and Deacon John Grisham, as well as Archimandrite Maximus Nachet, who will be leading this discussion. It is sure to be enlightening, certainly is important and timely that we would join together in this way. So tomorrow, the same Zoom link, the same Zoom information, 7 p.m. Please invite people to join us. Spread the word widely on this. And then the information that was sent out, it's also on the St. Amelia Ministries website. If you Google search St. Amelia, you'll be able to find all of this information, stamelia.com. So thank you again, Dr. John Mark, Dr. Reynolds, for your presentation tonight and answering so many questions. Sedna will ask you to please to close the evening.
Lord, now let us thou thy servant depart in peace according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people, a light to lighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. Dear Lord, we thank you for all the blessings we've received this day at your hand. We ask that you give us a night filled with sleep, that we may arise and give praise to your holy name. We ask this in the name of the Father, and of the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen.
Amen.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you all for joining us. Have a good evening.